German commanders were certain the Americans were finally beaten until the night they looked out across the French countryside and saw a line of headlights stretching so far into the darkness that it broke every rule of warfare they had ever learned. Because inside that endless column weren't tanks, or guns, or infantry, but thousands of trucks driven by soldiers no one had expected to matter, men who turned a crude, one-way road into a supply flood so overwhelming that it made German fuel calculations, defensive plans, and even the laws of physics completely irrelevant. And in that moment, the Wehrmacht's finest minds realized why their divisions kept collapsing while Patton's army kept accelerating, not because the Americans fought better, but because somewhere behind the front, 23,000 drivers were quietly building a weapon Germany had no defense against. August 1944 should have felt like the beginning of the end. German soldiers were falling back across France, defensive lines collapsing faster than they could be drawn, and Allied armor seemed to spill across the countryside like a tide no one could stop. But inside one command bunker in East Prussia, the mood was strangely calm. Not optimistic, the generals there were far too seasoned for optimism, but calm in the way a surgeon becomes calm when he knows he understands the patient better than anyone else. And on this night, the patient was the United States Army. Maps covered the walls in layers, each one pinned over another as if the staff had grown tired of erasing old front lines. The air smelled of pencil shavings, cigarette smoke, and damp concrete. A desk lamp buzzed faintly as Generaloberst Alfred Jodl leaned over the latest intelligence packet. He didn't even bother sitting. He'd seen the numbers before, or rather, he'd seen the pattern. Everything about Patton's advance screamed one fatal truth. The Americans were going too far, too fast. That alone didn't impress him. Speed meant nothing if it wasn't fed, and nothing in war consumed more than Patton's Third Army. Across the table, a major from the logistics branch flipped through his notes, reading out the figures without inflection, as if listing the ingredients for a recipe rather than the fate of an army. 12 American divisions, 400 miles from their beaches. 700 tons per infantry division. Over 1,000 per armored division. Jodl didn't need him to finish. The math spoke louder than the major ever could. "Add it," he said quietly. The major pressed his pencil to the paper. The scratch of graphite echoed unnaturally in the room. Numbers stacked, then a line, then a total. 12,000 tons of supplies per day. If the major had read the result with trembling hands or disbelief, Jodl might have reassured him. But the man simply nodded. It was exactly what every German officer expected. They had lived this reality in Russia. They had watched their own spearheads die inches from victory because tons of fuel and ammunition were stranded on roads too muddy or broken to carry trucks. No army on earth could sustain a mechanized advance over such distances. Not even theirs, the inventors of Blitzkrieg, and certainly not the Americans. It was almost comforting to say it out loud. They've outpaced their lifeline. Ardor. Another officer, one who had served with Panzer Group 2 inches 1941, laughed under his breath. "We've seen this before. Their tanks will slow, then halt, then starve." Haven Place. He wasn't mocking. It was simply the voice of experience, the voice of a man who had watched entire armored corps grind to a stop while the Soviets fled in terror ahead of them. Patton's momentum meant nothing if his fuel bowsers and ammunition trucks couldn't keep up, and German intelligence said they couldn't. Interrogated prisoners talked about gasoline rationing. Field reports mentioned American units halted for resupply. Luftwaffe pilots, what few were still flying, spotted columns of stalled vehicles choking French roads. Everything, every scrap of evidence painted the same picture. Patton's advance was about to choke itself. Jodl slid a ruler along the map. From Normandy to the forward American spearheads, the distance wasn't just long, it was obscene. The roads had been cratered, bridges destroyed, railways ripped from the ground. Even if the Americans owned the vehicles, they didn't own the infrastructure. They were racing on a skeleton of a transportation network. "This is their culminating point," Jodl said at last. He spoke the phrase the way a judge pronounces a sentence. Culminating point. The moment when an army ceases to be a hammer and becomes an anvil. When speed becomes vulnerability. when the impossible weight of supply crushes maneuver. He'd taught the concept at Staff College. He'd watched it break German offensives on the Eastern Front, and now he saw it tightening like a noose around Patton's neck. The room seemed to steady around that idea. Officers loosened their shoulders. A few even allowed themselves quiet conversation. For the first time in weeks, the Wehrmacht had found something predictable, an American mistake. One colonel looked almost relieved. They simply don't understand limits. They think industry replaces physics. How one? Another, older and more tired, snorted. They'll learn. Every army learns. Goes in. And they truly believed it. Not because they underestimated American courage or American skill, but because war had rules, brutal, immutable rules, and one of them was that no mechanized force could outrun its fuel. They didn't know that on the other side of France, a group of American officers were staring at the same numbers and refusing to accept them. They didn't know that thousands of trucks were being scraped together into an experiment no doctrine could explain. They didn't know that men who had never touched a rifle in combat were about to dictate the tempo of a continent-sized war. All the German staff knew. All they thought they needed to know was that Patton could not possibly sustain the pace he was moving. And so, as night settled over East Prussia, they began preparing for a battlefield that would finally slow the Americans down. They wrote orders. They drafted defensive lines. They plotted river crossings and fallback positions. They imagined, with almost clinical certainty, American tanks sitting silent on the far side of France, abandoned by the fuel that had carried them too boldly, too far. What they couldn't imagine was that the Americans were already building something. None of their textbooks covered a highway that only went one direction, a supply system that ignored every caution of military science, a river of engines poised to drown the very assumptions Germany clung to. By the time the first rumors reached them, it would be far too late. They chose a place no one would ever expect the future of the war to be decided, a French mansion that had once belonged to a textile baron, its velvet wallpaper scorched by German explosives, its stone corridors echoing with the hollow thump of American boots. It wasn't glamorous. It certainly wasn't headquarters material, but it was close to the front, close to Patton's spearhead, and close enough to the problem that had begun suffocating the Third Army's advance. Inside its grand hall, where crystal chandeliers hung blackened by smoke, a long banquet table had become a battlefield of maps, pencils, half-empty coffee mugs, and the worried eyes of officers who had run out of conventional answers. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres didn't sit. He was pacing a quick, clipped walk that revealed everything the others were trying not to say aloud. The Third Army wasn't slowing. It was starving. Patton's forward units were burning fuel faster than any American plan had ever predicted. Supply depots couldn't catch up. Railway heads were too far behind. Trucks were bogging down on cratered roads. Every hour the front moved east. The supply line stretched thinner, until it resembled a thread pulled to breaking. Ayres stopped pacing only when Colonel Charles O. Thrasher entered the room. Thrasher was older, heavier, and far too calm for the chaos that surrounded them. But the men knew why. He was the commander of the Motor Transport Service, the man expected to perform miracles when miracles were no longer optional. He took one look at the numbers pinned on the wall. Then he exhaled slowly, as if acknowledging the grim obvious. "This," he said, "doesn't work anymore." "Bye." A captain frowned. "Then we slow the advance." "Das got over." Ayres snapped back instantly. "Patton won't slow down. Even if he did, the Germans would stabilize. They'd build new lines. We'd lose momentum. Weller Wev." The room fell silent. Everyone knew he was right. Patton didn't pause. Patton didn't consolidate. He crushed. If he stopped now, even for a few days, the entire Allied schedule risked collapsing. Thrasher placed both palms on the table. "Then we changed the math." "Oh." The officers exchanged confused glances. Change the math? Distances were distances. Consumption was consumption. Physics didn't negotiate. But the colonel wasn't finished. "Rail won't save us. Depots won't save us. Scheduled convoys won't save us. We need a completely new system. Here." A young lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "Sir, with respect, we don't have a new system. We barely have roads." "Well," Ayres stepped beside Thrasher. His voice was sharp, certain, almost dangerous in its confidence. "Then we build a road that belongs only to us." "Izad." Someone laughed out of disbelief. "A road? Colonel, the Germans blew half of France on their way out." E7 to screen, with Hadatel next to video. "No," Ayers said. "Not a road, a flow, a moving artery that never stops long enough to die." "Well, Dot." He walked to the map, grabbed a piece of chalk, and drew 2 parallel lines stretching from Cherbourg to the front. "One way east," he said, tapping the top line. "One way west," tapping the bottom. No cross traffic, no interruptions, no waiting, no blackout discipline, no doctrine, no stopping except for fuel. Well, 2. That last sentence froze the room. No blackout discipline? Running headlights at night in a war zone? "That's suicide," a major muttered. "The Luftwaffe will slice us apart." "Why?" Ayers answered without hesitation. "Luftwaffe." "What Luftwaffe? They can barely get planes in the air. We take the risk. We run lights. We move faster than they can hit." "Workstand," Thrasher backed him up. "Gentlemen, the enemy is expecting us to behave like a normal army, so we're going to do the opposite." Very first, the table erupted in doubts. "You'll clog the roads, Tuite. You'll drown in breakdowns. We haven't here 5,000 miles of truck wear in 2 weeks. We mazad toint. You're ignoring every logistical principle. We have no is." Ayers slammed his fist onto the table so hard that dust rose from the old wood. "Yes," he barked. "We are ignoring every logistical principle, because those principles assume an army fights slowly. We don't have the luxury of slow." "Why do?" Thrasher added quietly. "If we play by the book, men die. Patton stops. And the Germans survive the summer." End quote. The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't resistance. It was realization. They weren't debating a tactic. They were deciding whether the Third Army would live or die. Ayers continued, lowering his voice. "What we're proposing isn't elegance. It's brute force. Raw volume. A convoy system so aggressive the Germans won't understand it until it's too late. He pointed again to the chalk lines. A one-way highway, gentlemen. 20 hours driving. 4 hours for fuel and emergency repairs. Every truck in the European theater. Every skilled driver we can find. Moving in a single direction. Forward." "Whiles." "Well, I was not 47. Someone whispered, almost reverently, This would be the largest supply operation in history." "We're sad," Thrasher nodded. "Then let's make history." Aye. There was no dramatic music, no applause, just the sound of pencils scratching orders, maps unfolding, and junior officers running down the hallway with instructions they barely understood. But something had shifted. In that dim French mansion, a decision had been made not to follow doctrine, but to demolish it. Not to preserve trucks, but to burn them out like ammunition. Not to wait for rails, but to lay a river of engines across the continent. Outside, the sun had set. Inside, the future Red Ball Express had just taken its first breath, a reckless, impossible idea that would soon become the nightmare Jodl never plotted on any of his beautifully drawn maps. And at that moment, the men in that mansion understood one thing with terrifying clarity. If Patton was going to keep moving, they would have to invent a way to drag the entire U.S. Army across France, mile by mile, at the speed of war itself. The plan existed on paper for less than 6 hours before the sound of engines began swallowing the fields around the French mansion. It didn't start with order. It started with chaos, the kind of chaos that comes when an army rewrites its own rules overnight. Drivers stumbled out of tents they had barely pitched the night before. Mechanics scrambled to sort crates of tools that had been dumped from trucks like spilled organs. MPs argued with supply officers over who had the authority to redirect rural traffic. And everywhere, trucks rolled in from every direction. Battered 2.5s from the Normandy beaches. Fresh vehicles unloaded from Liberty ships. Jeeps repurposed as dispatch escorts. Even French civilian buses commandeered because nobody could afford to let a single driver waste fuel on anything except cargo. A French farmer watching this tidal wave of machinery reportedly whispered, "It looks like they're moving a city." If things that. He wasn't wrong. The first task was to carve order from the storm. Ayer's officers spread out like surgeons triaging the wounded. They marked the designated eastbound route with red circles painted on whatever they could find. Bombed road signs, pieces of plywood, the sides of abandoned barns. A private with an engineering background nailed the very first marker into a tree and announced, "Gentlemen, this is the beginning of the highway. We have to left to." It wasn't hyperbole. That tree stood at the mouth of what would soon become the most aggressive supply artery ever built in modern war. By noon, MPs established the new commandments of the road. No stopping, no passing unless ordered, no turning around, no spacing errors, no darkness discipline. Every officer who had ever studied convoy doctrine stared at the rules as if reading a list of sins. But the MPs didn't quote doctrine. They quoted Ayer's. "This road isn't military. It's industrial. You don't drive like soldiers. You drive like factory belts." Farther down the route, teams of mechanics erected the first of dozens of mobile maintenance points, improvised garages made from canvas tarps, crates of spare parts, and whatever equipment could be salvaged from damaged French workshops. The rules here were even harsher. 15 minutes. Fix it, or shove it off the road. A corporal pulled the hood off a failing truck, listened to the cough of its engine, and shouted over the noise, "Carburetor shot! Off the road!" Oh, the driver protested, but there was no time for sympathy. A bulldozer brigade operating behind the mechanics pushed crippled vehicles into ditches like discarded tin cans. The sight horrified some officers. Ayers only shrugged. One dead truck is better than a dead convoy. The eastbound flow thickened rapidly. Convoy commanders counted their intervals with a stopwatch. 30 seconds between vehicles. That was the goal. Not 5 minutes. Not the cautious military spacing every instructor drilled into recruits. 30 seconds, barely enough time to blink before the next truck's grill filled your mirrors. The road vibrated with the combined weight. Engines coughed, roared, and stabilized into a collective hum, a kind of mechanical heartbeat that felt utterly unnatural in wartime. At night, when the order came to run with headlights blinding the darkness, the first drivers hesitated. Not from fear, but because no soldier had ever been told to invite enemy aircraft so boldly. An MP leaned in the window of a young driver and said simply, "Son, the Germans can't stop what they can't catch. Turn on your lights." And, quote, when the headlights flicked on, the landscape transformed. The French countryside lit up like a runway. Thousands of beams aligned into a luminous ribbon stretching to the horizon. It wasn't just a convoy. It was a declaration. And still, the system needed shape, order, identity. Thrasher ordered 2 lanes of traffic to be physically separated, not by barriers, but by doctrine. The right lane became the lifeline east, the left lane the empty return west. No vehicle was allowed to violate direction. Anyone caught drifting into the wrong lane, even by accident, was yanked out of their truck and reassigned. A few reckless drivers tried shortcuts. A few officers demanded priority for their divisions. A few MPs threatened mutiny after 12 hours of traffic control, but slowly, painfully, the artery began to pulse with regularity. The first full convoys, polished by sweat and exhaustion, rolled out in formation. 60 to 70 trucks per column, pushing through dust clouds that hung above the road like smoke from a furnace. A lieutenant riding shotgun in one of those early convoys described the sensation perfectly. It felt like we weren't in France anymore. It felt like we were inside a machine. Well, is matter, and in a sense, they were. A machine no general had ever planned for. A machine designed to run until it burned itself out. A machine whose only measure of success was how much it could haul before its drivers collapsed. Village after village awoke to the rumble and stared in disbelief. Some French civilians cheered. Others crossed themselves. They had never seen anything like it, a man-made river, wide as the road and loud as thunder. By dusk of the first full day, the Red Ball Corridor, though the name had not fully stuck, yet carried more vehicles in a single hour than the Germans moved on some fronts in an entire week. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't organized in the European sense, but it was alive, growing, and every mile it stretched east, German predictions about American paralysis withered a little more. Because while the generals in East Prussia believed the Americans were slowing, the rolling city they had never imagined was beginning to accelerate its engines, its drivers, its chaos welded into a single, unstoppable force. A force built not in months, but in one impossible day. If the Red Ball Express was a machine, then its engine wasn't the trucks. It was the men behind the wheel, the soldiers no one planned for, no one expected, and almost no one outside the front lines ever credited. 23,000 drivers, 75% African American. All of them thrust into a role no doctrine, no staff college, no pre-war planning had ever imagined, sustaining the speed of an army that refused to slow down. They came from Louisiana, Detroit, Chicago, Harlem, Mississippi, sons of factory workers, sharecroppers, mechanics, cooks, bricklayers. Many had joined the army, hoping to fight. Instead, segregation had placed them behind the wheel of trucks they hadn't chosen, on roads no sane officer wanted to drive. But once the red ball began moving, something strange happened. They realized that the war, the real war, the one that determined who lived and who lost, now depended on them. And when men who have been underestimated all their lives are suddenly given the fate of an army to carry, they grip the wheel a little tighter. Official doctrine said each truck had a chain of command. Unofficial doctrine, the one that kept men alive, came from the drivers themselves. They developed their own code within hours. If you fall below 20 miles an hour, you're a hazard. Very 5. If you're tired, drive anyway. Sleep later. Be sen of that tackler. If a truck dies, mercy kill it. Don't stall the convoy. 2005 Ninder. Stay awake. Stay straight. Stay moving. 2. But the most sacred rule was the one whispered from cab to cab. You keep Patton fed. 8 Nowing. A driver named John L. Houston explained it better than any officer ever could. We weren't hauling gas. We were hauling the Third Army on our backs, east to O, and they did it with a kind of grim humor, forged under heat, exhaustion, and the knowledge that failure meant infantrymen up front would go hungry or die. They painted slogans to ward off fear. Hitler can't stop us. I'd. Patton's lifeline. From's. Detroit to Berlin. I. Each truck became its own identity, a rolling piece of defiance, an act of rebellion against every expectation set over them since birth. Most drivers didn't fear the Germans. They feared sleep. The grind was brutal. 20 hours behind the wheel, 4 hours to eat, refuel, and maybe, close their eyes. Engine heat turned cabins into ovens. Dust choked throats raw. Rain hammered windshields until wipers failed and drivers squinted through blurred glass. Some hallucinated. Some drove with windows open in freezing night air just to stay conscious. Some jammed matchsticks under their eyelids. A young driver once drifted into the wrong lane after 36 hours awake. An MP hauled him from the cab, slapped him so hard the dust lifted from his face, and shoved him into the passenger seat of another truck. Sleep, the MP said, or you're going to kill the guy behind you. If de Brengs roke, he slept for 20 minutes. Then he got another truck and went back out. Nobody questioned it. Nobody complained. The front was waiting. The Army kept the drivers segregated on lists, reports, barracks. The Red Ball ignored all of it. A white corporal from Ohio once wrote, I never cared who was driving the truck ahead of me. I only cared that he kept moving. And they always did. About. On the road, respect wasn't given. It was earned by survival. And the black drivers earned it in every brutal shift, driving through fog, driving through rain, driving through terrain so chewed by war that one bad swerve could flip a truck carrying 5 tons of ammunition. Some German POWs, forced to load trucks under guard, stared in disbelief as African American sergeants calculated weight balance faster than German engineers trained for years. One prisoner muttered, This is not what our textbooks said about them. He's wanted the turnes. War has a way of smashing lies. One evening near Alençon, a truck overheated and burst into flames. Standard protocol said, jump out and run. But the driver saw the Red Cross painted on his cargo, medical supplies. Knocking flames from his sleeves, he drove the burning truck 2 miles to a field hospital, bailed out at the last second as the cab collapsed behind him. Doctors saved dozens of wounded soldiers that night, American and German, with the supplies he refused to abandon. Stories like that never made it into press briefings, but they circulated through red ball camps like legend. And legends matter. They became fuel, the only kind the drivers produced themselves. By the third day, the eastbound lane became something no one in Europe had ever seen. A moving wall of metal, stretching further than any single driver could see. Truck after truck, minute after minute, hour after hour, each one holding enough fuel or ammunition to change the shape of a battlefield. And as the red ball began to take form, the drivers understood something far more terrifying than enemy ambushes. If even one of them hesitated, the entire system failed. Thousands of men depending on thousands of men who had been told their whole lives they were secondary. Now they were indispensable. Patton didn't move unless they moved. The artillery didn't fire unless they delivered. The front line didn't advance unless they kept their hands on the wheel and their eyes open. They were not spectators. They were not support. They were not background. They were the pulse of the war. And every mile they drove pulled the German timetable apart, one heartbeat at a time. Long before the German high command understood what the Americans were building, the first warnings came from men who had no interest in strategy, only in what their binoculars showed them. They were reconnaissance troops, thin, exhausted, stretched across hedgerows and hillsides from the Seine to the Loire. Their orders were simple: observe American roads, report traffic, estimate tempo. But within days of the red ball beginning its crawl across France, those simple reports turned strange, then alarming, then unbelievable. At 6:40 one morning, a sergeant from a reconnaissance battalion radioed in a message that his commander thought must have been mistranslated. Continuous vehicles, no gaps, lights on, multiple columns. Artie said, "Lights? Columns? Continuous?" A lieutenant climbed the ridge himself, wiped the fog off his field glasses, and stared. For a moment, he wondered if the Americans had launched an offensive somewhere behind their own lines. The amount of movement seemed too high for mere supply. But then the truth struck him. These weren't tanks, not artillery, not armored cars. They were trucks, thousands of trucks, a crawling steel centipede that filled the road from horizon to horizon. He wrote in his field journal a line that would later circulate through German intelligence like a rumor from the underworld. The Americans have built a road that moves. 80 Sauve. When the first full reports reached division HQs, most officers dismissed them as exaggeration. Lights on at night? Impossible. Americans would never abandon blackout discipline. It violated every principle of survivability the Wehrmacht held sacred. And yet the reports kept coming. A colonel from Panzer Lehr read the summaries, slammed the folder shut, and muttered, "Either our scouts have lost their minds, or the Americans no longer fear us." Why? Both interpretations were equally terrifying. One evening, General Lieutenant Edgar Feichtinger of the 21st Panzer Division decided to see the phenomenon for himself. He chose a concealed hillside overlooking a major eastbound route. When the sun dipped, he pressed his binoculars to his eyes and didn't lower them for a full minute. What he saw violated everything he had been trained to believe. Headlights glowed like a river of white fire, unbroken, undispersed, unconcerned with the Luftwaffe or artillery. Trucks passed every half minute, sometimes faster. Engines roared without pause. Feuchtinger lowered his glasses and whispered, almost involuntarily, "This is not war. This is industry on wheels." One of Vitan, German artillery officers attempted to model firing solutions for the convoys, but no math worked. The columns were too dense to disrupt without overwhelming fire, too fast to ambush, too redundant to cripple. A logistics analyst from Army Group B tried a different angle. "Destroy 300 trucks," he wrote, "and the Americans lose capacity." But that was the logic of a European army, not an industrial one. Destroy 300 trucks? The Americans would replace them in 2 days. Destroy 1,000? They'd replace those too. One German officer later admitted, "We were trained to fight armies. We were not trained to fight factories." And rumors spread faster than orders. Some German platoons swore they could hear the convoys even when none were nearby, a low, constant growl that seemed to vibrate through the night air like an omen. Ghost engines, they called them. a young infantryman wrote home. "We advance with 3 bullets each. They roar past with enough ammunition to supply a division. We cannot fight an enemy who does not run out." 2. As the red ball intensified, the psychological cost deepened. Whenever German troops prepared a counterattack, the same sound broke them. Engines. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. They knew what it meant. Another American advance. Another artillery barrage. Another armored thrust fueled by an endless column of trucks they couldn't see, couldn't stop, couldn't understand. A Wehrmacht lieutenant, captured later in Belgium, summed it up with a bleak shrug. "You Americans attacked with tanks, but you defeated us with noise." Wehrgsein. By early September, German intelligence compiled all reconnaissance notes into a single, chilling report. The conclusion was not written in bold, but it didn't need to be. American supply exceeds our theoretical limits. Conventional prediction no longer applies. Hey, it wasn't just that the Americans were moving faster. It was that the Germans could no longer predict when they would stop or if they would stop at all. That uncertainty, that terrifying lack of boundaries, was the first crack in the Wehrmacht's belief that the war could still be saved. Because once a professional army loses faith in its own calculations, the battlefield ceases to obey strategy. It obeys fear, and the Red Ball Express was fear made mechanical. What the Germans saw from their hillsides was only the surface, a glowing, thunderous skin stretched over a beast far stranger than anything military science had ever imagined. The Red Ball Express did not work because it was efficient. It worked because it embraced a logic so alien to European warfare that it might as well have been black magic. To the German staff officers studying those early reports, the math simply did not add up. A convoy every 30 seconds? Tons delivered per hour that exceeded entire corps allocations? Breakdowns measured in thousands not as failures, but as accepted sacrifices? This wasn't an army following rules. This was an army rewriting them. American quartermaster officers had long known the consumption curves of war. Fuel burned faster the farther it was hauled. Vehicles devoured themselves with every mile, and roads punished overworked engines like a slow-moving guillotine. But the Red Ball Express didn't obey those curves. 12,000 tons a day had once been the theoretical maximum. Now the Americans were pushing beyond that, sometimes nearly double. In the first week alone, drivers delivered almost 90,000 tons. Not because the system was smooth. It wasn't. It was a mess, but it was a productive mess. The kind Detroit understood intimately. Where European militaries prized precision, American logistics prized one thing: output at all costs. A German staff captain, poring over captured American transport reports, wrote in frustration, "They waste more than we produce." If we can't, he meant it as an insult. It was actually the secret. To the Germans, maintenance was ritual, a sacred schedule of inspections, repairs, and conservation. A Wehrmacht truck could receive more attention than the soldier driving it. To the Americans, maintenance was triage. Engine coughing? Replace it. Transmission slipping? Strip it from another truck. Chassis cracked? Leave it in the ditch and cannibalize the rest. Spare parts too slow? Cut them from a wrecked French bus and make them fit. The Germans rebuilt vehicles. The Americans consumed them. That was the ideological difference. One side believed machines were precious. The other believed machines were disposable, but time was not. A single phrase became the unofficial creed of the Red Ball Express. If it moves for one more trip, it's good enough. 124. Nothing in German military tradition could grasp that logic. It was not elegant. It was not strategic in the academic sense. It was industrial brutality harnessed for war. Then came the secret the Germans didn't uncover until it was too late. The Americans weren't feeding the Red Ball Express from the beaches alone. They were feeding it from the ocean floor. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was one of the strangest engineering gambles of the war. Flexible pipelines laid across the English Channel, pumping gasoline under the waves like veins carrying blood to a giant whose appetite only grew. German intelligence had missed it entirely. Instead, they kept waiting for fuel shortages that never came. Because while the Germans rationed drops, the Americans built lakes. Every 25 miles along the Red Ball corridor Forward fuel depots rose like industrial outposts. Bladders, drums, tanker trucks, arranged in patterns that looked chaotic, but operated with frightening speed. 10 minutes was the average wait time for refueling. If a truck waited longer, MPs stormed in and forced movement. The Germans could not comprehend it. One officer wrote after the war, "They burned more moving gasoline than we received for whole armies." Too half a very. To German strategists, that level of waste should have been suicide. To American logisticians, it was acceptable overhead. Even more bewildering was the maintenance network that trailed the convoys like a ghost army. Every 50 miles, a mobile maintenance station, really a collection of mechanics, cranes, tool trucks, and spare engines, set up shop. Their job wasn't to fix trucks, it was to judge them. They had 15 minutes per vehicle, not 15 minutes to repair, 15 minutes to decide, fix, patch, or sacrifice. If a truck could be revived quickly, it was pushed back into the flow. If not, it was dragged off the road, stripped for organs, and abandoned without ceremony. The Germans believed breakdowns would stop the Americans. But breakdowns only fed the system. Every dead truck became a donor for 3 others. It was the logistical equivalent of shedding skin, painful, relentless, and unstoppable. As the red ball expanded, problems multiplied. Traffic jams, axles snapping, drivers collapsing, tire blowouts, bridges crumbling, roads turning to mud. Any one of these would have paralyzed a normal army. But the Americans attacked each crisis with a speed that stunned even their own commanders. When one bottleneck formed near Laval, engineers bulldozed a bypass road through a field in 4 hours. When fuel drums ran short, tanker trucks were rerouted from completely unrelated units without permission. When a rail line was needed, American railroad battalions rebuilt 100 miles of track while trucks still thundered over the adjacent highway. The most surreal moment came when a French transport officer, baffled by the disarray, asked a Red Ball lieutenant, "Who was in charge of all this?" "I'm mad." The lieutenant laughed. "No one. And everyone. That's why it works." He's not minus. German strategists miscalculated the most crucial factor of all: redundancy. The Americans did not rely on one convoy. They relied on hundreds. Destroy one? 5 more arrived within minutes. Block a road? Engineers carved a new one. Bomb a bridge? A replacement rose in hours. Cut off fuel? Pluto pumped more across the sea. It wasn't genius. It wasn't brilliance. It was mass. Raw, unapologetic, industrial mass, the kind that smothered elegant strategy beneath a weight too heavy to resist. To the Germans, the laws of logistics were iron. To the Americans, they were suggestions. The Red Ball Express didn't ignore physics. It drowned it. By mid-September, American supply deliveries were surpassing what German analysts had once assumed was physically possible by a factor of 3, sometimes 4. A Wehrmacht major captured late in the war described it with bitter simplicity. "We thought they were breaking the rules. We didn't understand they were playing a different game. If the Somme..." End quote. And slowly, inexorably, every mile the Red Ball conquered became another nail in the coffin of German operational theory. The war was no longer about maneuver. It was about momentum. And the Americans had built a momentum engine. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express had grown into something beyond even the most optimistic American predictions. It moved material at a rate no logistics officer had ever dared imagine. It fed Patton's armored thrusts so consistently that the Third Army's speed became a kind of legend even among its enemies. But every miracle has a breaking point, and the Red Ball was approaching its own. The first signs didn't appear in headquarters. They appeared in the faces of the drivers, the hollow eyes, the slurred speech, the hands that trembled when they reached for the gear shift. Men who had once joked through exhaustion now climbed from their cabs in silence, as if the road were slowly draining their souls 1 mile at a time. The route had stretched, and kept stretching. What had begun as a 350-mile lifeline was now pushing past 700 miles round trip. Trucks spent more time burning fuel than delivering it. Every convoy felt longer, slower, heavier. Drivers who once finished their trips in 14 hours now needed 18. then 20, then more. A sergeant in the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company said it best. We weren't racing the Germans anymore. We were racing the distance. He's of Deverent. The French countryside, battered by months of fighting, finally struck back. Bridges sagged under the constant weight of overloaded trucks. Road shoulders crumbled into ditches. Rain turned sections of the corridor into slick mud traps. Dust storms rose in the dry heat, turning visibility to zero. One night near Le Mans, 30 trucks stalled on an incline, their engines overheated, their loads too heavy, their drivers too tired. The jam backed up for a mile, then 2, then 10. MPs sprinted down the line, shouting for men to stay in their cabs, to keep their engines alive, to resist the temptation to close their eyes even for a second. But exhaustion was now the enemy that no rifle could defeat. Drivers slumped forward, asleep at the wheel. Some crashed into trucks ahead of them. Others drifted across lanes and nearly collided with returning convoys. The system that had once seemed unstoppable was starting to shake apart. On September 8th, a reconnaissance report landed on a German frontline HQ table. The message, written with unusual excitement, claimed, American supply lines slowing, convoy intervals widening, vehicle speed decreasing. Well, for the first time since Normandy, German staff officers tasted the faint burn of hope. Perhaps the Americans had finally pushed too hard. Perhaps the laws of logistics had finally returned to collect their debt. Perhaps, just perhaps, the Third Army would stall. A panzer colonel, reviewing the maps, said aloud, "This is the crack we have waited for." And why wouldn't he believe that? Every rule in the book said the Americans were now too far, too tired, too overextended. If the Red Ball slowed, even slightly, Patton's tanks would starve within days. The Germans prepared to counterattack. Inside the American command posts, officers watched in horror as reports came flooding in. Convoy separation increasing, breakdowns doubling, accidents spiking, drivers collapsing mid-route, fuel consumption skyrocketing. The Red Ball's tempo, once its greatest strength, had become a blade pointed back at its own heart. A lieutenant colonel slammed his fist into his desk, shouting, "We're losing the corridor!" Was venerated, but Ayres and Thrasher, the architects of the madness, didn't panic. They didn't revise the plan. They didn't slow operations. Instead, they did something only American logistics could do. They tore the system apart and rebuilt it in 72 hours. First came the shattering of the route into segments. No longer would one driver endure 700-mile marathons. Convoys were divided into short, ferocious sprints, 150 miles, then handoff. Like relay runners, trucks swapped loads at hastily built transfer depots, dirt lots ringed with MPs and lanterns, glowing like islands in a sea of night. Next came the expansion of maintenance forward. Engineers surged to the front, establishing new repair hubs closer to Patton's spearheads. Trucks no longer limped back hundreds of miles for repairs, the repairs came to them. Then the Americans unleashed their ultimate weapon. More trucks, 2,000 additional vehicles, some newly arrived from U.S. ports, others stolen from unrelated units, were thrown onto the route. It didn't matter if a division commander protested. It didn't matter if paperwork went missing. The corridor needed mass, and mass was what it received. Tire shortages? Quartermasters emptied depots intended for other armies. Fuel shortages? Pluto increased output. Driver shortages? Replacement men were trained in 48 hours and placed behind the wheel. The Germans saw the slowdown. They celebrated it. They prepared for the American advance to choke. But what they didn't see, not until it was too late, was the shift. A surge. A tightening. A rhythm. A pulse. By September 12th, the Red Ball Express wasn't merely recovered. It was faster, more efficient, more ruthless, more alive. Tonnage increased. Turnaround times shrank. Convoy spacing tightened again. The beast had broken itself and emerged stronger. German staff officers waited for news of Patton's stall. Instead, they received something else. Patton was moving faster than ever. Their hopes dissolved almost instantly. What they had interpreted as the beginning of collapse had been only a brief exhale. Before another strike, the Red Ball Express, battered, stretched, pushed past human limits, had refused to die. A German major captured weeks later summed it up with bitter awe. They did not stop where we would have stopped. They did not slow where we would have slowed. They broke, and then they ran faster. It's not a gather. And as September rolled on, the Wehrmacht realized the truth. The American supply line was not a line at all. It was a living thing, a creature that could suffer, bleed, falter, and still keep coming. And nothing terrifies an army more than an enemy that refuses to obey the limits war was built upon. Long before the Red Ball Express shattered German strategy, it did something far more dangerous. It shattered German certainty. And in war, certainty is oxygen. Once it disappears, fear replaces it quietly at first, then violently. The earliest cracks didn't appear in command bunkers or staff journals. They appeared in foxholes, trenches, and ruined farmhouses where exhausted Wehrmacht troops tried to sleep. Because sleep required silence, and silence was the one thing the Americans no longer allowed. Every night, it began the same way. A faint vibration underfoot, a soft rumble in the distance, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. Men sat upright, gripping their rifles not from threat but from confusion. What unit was moving? Why so late? Why so loud? And why didn't it stop? A private scribbled in a battered notebook. The night no longer belongs to us. It belongs to their trucks. Golden $5. German doctrine taught that night was a time for stillness, for concealment, caution, muted movement. An army that moved carelessly after dark invited artillery, aircraft, disaster. Yet every evening, across valleys and through forests and over shattered stone villages, the Americans sent their convoys roaring into the darkness with headlights blazing. Not stealth, not discipline, defiance. A sergeant of the 12th Panzer Division recalled years later, "We thought they were mocking us. How could they be so careless?" Then we realized it was not carelessness. It was confidence. Oh, the headlights were visible from miles away. The drone of engines rolled across the countryside like a living storm front. You could see the glow reflected in low-hanging clouds. Some units swore the horizon pulsed with the rhythm of the convoy. It didn't feel like men moving supplies. It felt like the ground itself was shifting, and every driver, every engine, every clattering crate of ammunition carried a psychological message far colder than any bullet. We will not run out. Bring 7. By late summer, frontline German troops received absurdly low resupply. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Infantry patrols sometimes carried only 3 rounds per man. Tank crews counted their remaining fuel in hours, not days. Meanwhile, American trucks passed within earshot loaded so full the tarps bulged. One German officer, hiding in a tree line near Chartres, counted trucks by whispering each number under his breath. He made it to 300 before he simply let his arm fall. His report read only, "They have more trucks than we have soldiers," to 18. It wasn't true in literal numbers, but psychologically, it didn't matter. The Germans believed it. Belief kills morale faster than any tank. But the most disturbing moment came when the Red Ball's presence began warping perception. Some nights, when no convoy was within miles, German units still heard the engines. Mechanics swore the ground vibrated when no truck touched the road. Infantrymen claimed they could hear the rumble through their boots, not their ears. And because fear loves patterns, these illusions gained a name: ghost convoys. Oh, a young soldier wrote to his sister, "We try to rest, but the American trucks pass in our dreams. Their noise doesn't stop, not even in sleep." 2. What made the phenomenon even more devastating was that American psychological warfare officers noticed it and exploited it. They began broadcasting recorded truck engine sounds toward German positions when no real convoy was present. The results were immediate. Units reported immense American movement where none existed. Officers miscalculated strength. Artillery wasted shells firing at phantoms. Sleep deprivation spread like disease. In the words of one captured German major, "Their trucks attacked us even when they weren't there." To Deus. The Germans had spent years believing superiority lay in skill, the angle of an armored plate, the precision of a gun sight, the discipline of a panzer crew. They measured war in terms of sharpness. The Americans measured it in tons. and that difference, a philosophical divide more than a tactical one, crippled the Wehrmacht's spirit. A panzer colonel wrote in a grim memorandum, "We can defeat their soldiers. We cannot defeat their machines." 1. What he failed to realize was that the machines were not the true threat, the drivers were. Men who endured exhaustion most soldiers would find suicidal. Men who treated danger as routine. Men who didn't stop simply because the route was dangerous or the weather murderous. You cannot intimidate an enemy who does not pause long enough to be intimidated. By the second week of September, German divisions began redeploying more cautiously, not because of tanks, not because of infantry, because they were terrified of running into fresh American units that had been resupplied overnight by those infernal convoys. Some captain scrawled on a field map, "Expect Americans to be stronger every morning than the night before." Anyway, it was the first time German planners acknowledged something beyond their control. The Americans were fighting a time-accelerated war. Every night, the rumble grew. Every morning, the Americans had more shells, more fuel, more men, more momentum. And the Germans had less of everything. The Red Ball Express didn't just feed Patton, it drained the enemy's will to resist. When the sound of engines becomes the sound of inevitability, even the bravest soldiers feel the line break inside them. By mid-September, the Wehrmacht's senior leadership finally began to confront a truth they had spent years denying, a truth hidden beneath the ruins of their own assumptions. They had not just misjudged American logistics. They had mocked it. And mockery is the most expensive mistake in war. For years, German officers believed that American abundance was softness disguised as strength. Too many vehicles, too much fuel, too little discipline. Inefficient, they called it. Wasteful. Well, they laughed at the United States as if industry could not be a weapon. But now, standing on the collapsing front, from the Seine to the Moselle, the Germans watched the consequences arriving by the truckload literally, and the bill for that arrogance was coming due. When Paris was liberated, German officers were stunned, not by the speed of the American infantry, but by the impossible fact that those infantry were being resupplied faster than they advanced. A German colonel captured near Fontainebleau admitted under interrogation, "We planned to defend Paris for 2 weeks. You supplied your forces faster than we could retreat." Here, to Hever, in War College terms, the Americans had violated the culminating point of advance, a limit every German strategist held sacred. Patton's spearheads should have died on the vine. Instead, they tore through German lines so far and so fast that intelligence officers questioned their own maps. It wasn't that German divisions were outmaneuvered. They were outsupplied. War had shifted from a contest of tactics to a contest of tempo, and the Americans owned tempo like a patent. Inside bunkers and chateau headquarters, thick with cigarette smoke and desperation, the German staff did what they always did when outmatched. They analyzed. They plotted American positions on overlays. They calculated the rate of tank fuel burn. They mapped the length of U.S. supply lines. They compared consumption curves to theoretical limits. And every time, the numbers delivered the same comforting lie. The Americans will slow. They must slow. But they didn't. Because the Red Ball Express didn't follow theory. It followed volume. And volume is not constrained by elegance, only by production. By the time the Germans realized their equations were wrong, the equations themselves had become irrelevant. The Americans were not operating according to European limits. They were operating according to American capacity, and capacity will always beat precision. In the forests of Lorraine and the shattered villages of eastern France, German field commanders found their troops increasingly reluctant to counterattack. Not because they feared American soldiers, many still respected U.S. infantry but did not dread it, but because they feared what stood behind the American infantry. Endless trucks, endless ammunition, endless fuel, endless momentum. One lieutenant reported to his divisional HQ, "Every time we prepare to launch an attack, the Americans arrive with more than we thought they could possibly have." Another, more bitter, wrote, "They are not fighting with men, they are fighting with factories." To Hafer of that. This new kind of warfare, war driven by industrial inertia rather than tactical brilliance, drained morale faster than casualties. German units still fought with determination, but they no longer believed they were fighting a solvable problem. A soldier can fight an enemy. A soldier cannot fight inevitability. On September 15, 1944, the German commander in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, received a consolidated intelligence packet detailing the full scale of American supply operations. He studied it in silence for almost an hour. Then he pronounced the sentence that finally pierced the illusion of German superiority. "We have assumed their culminating point, but the Americans have no culminating point." "Have did?" His operations officer asked what that meant for the coming months. Rundstedt replied, "It means the war is no longer about battles. It is about who can move faster, and they have built a system that will move forever." He advanced to, in his mind, something snapped not in panic, but in resignation. Germany's strategy had been built on the idea that supply limited warfare. America's strategy had been built on the idea that supply could accelerate warfare. The Germans were playing chess. The Americans were rolling conveyor belts. The Germans had hoped to stabilize the front along the West Wall, the last defensive line before the German heartland. But when they saw American trucks closing the distance faster than their retreating units could fall back, they realized something devastating. They were being overtaken by logistics. No matter how skillfully they fought, no matter how bravely their soldiers resisted, the simple, crushing truth was this: American supply moved faster than German recovery. American movement outpaced German planning. American industry outlived German endurance. The Wehrmacht had never faced an enemy like this. Not in Africa, not in Russia, not in France. And by the time they understood it, the Red Ball Express had already paid for the final chapter of the war, mile after mile, ton after ton, engine after engine. They had mocked American logistics. Now they were drowning in it. When the Red Ball Express was finally shut down in November 1944, there was no ceremony, no victory parade, no speeches. It ended the same way it had begun, abruptly, chaotically, and with trucks still warm from the last runs. One morning, the drivers woke to new orders. Route closed. Report for reassignment. To one of those, just like that, the greatest logistics experiment in modern warfare vanished from the roads of France. But what it left behind was far larger than the convoy lanes, the broken bridges, or the deep ruts carved into the countryside. It left behind a blueprint, one so revolutionary that it would shape the future of warfare and the future of an entire nation. When German officers, captured months later, reviewed Allied records, one statistic stunned them more than the tonnage or the miles. The Red Ball Express dissolved in 72 hours. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. Their own supply operations took weeks to assemble, months to operate, and sometimes years to unwind. The Americans had built a logistics civilization that spanned half of France, then dismantled it in 3 days as if folding a tent. A former Wehrmacht logistics colonel later wrote, "They created massive systems the way we built shelters, temporary, adaptable, and discarded without regret." The Red Ball Express wasn't meant to last. Its power came from the fact that it didn't need to. It existed only as long as Patton needed to move. Once rail lines caught up, once ports expanded, once new supply corridors came online, the Red Ball simply evaporated its drivers, absorbed into other units, its trucks redistributed like grains of sand. War had never seen anything so large vanish so fast. The drivers, exhausted, uncelebrated, and changed in ways they could never fully express, were scattered across Europe. Some were reassigned to port battalions, others to engineering units. A few finally got their wish to enter combat roles. They carried with them a pride that even the Army's segregation policies couldn't smother, because they knew what they had done. They had fueled an army that rewrote the battlefield. They had outrun fear, exhaustion, and enemy fire. They had proven, mile by brutal mile, that victory sometimes depends not on the heroism of charging forward, but the resilience of never stopping. One African-American driver, interviewed decades later, put it simply, "We didn't get medals. We didn't need them. We knew the war couldn't move without us." Where quais changes. After the war, something unexpected happened, something no general, no historian, and certainly no German officer had predicted. Thousands of Red Ball veterans returned home with a skill set no civilian had. They had operated the largest, fastest, most aggressive trucking network ever created. They had mastered 24-hour driving. They had mastered route discipline under chaos. They had mastered improvisation, repair, and judgment on no sleep. They had lived inside a system where speed mattered more than beauty, and where movement mattered more than perfection. And they took that knowledge into civilian life. American highway systems, long-haul trucking companies, freight distribution networks, supply chain management. Many of the institutions that would define the second half of the 20th century were shaped directly or indirectly by Red Ball veterans. Companies like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were built by men who had lived inside the crucible of wartime logistics. The Red Ball Express didn't just shorten the war. It helped build the architecture of modern America. Military theorists studied the Red Ball Express long after the war ended. They found principles that violated everything they once believed. Volume beats efficiency. Redundancy replaced perfection. Decentralization accelerates tempo. Machines can be sacrificed. Time cannot. Logistics isn't support, it is strategy. These ideas reshaped NATO doctrine, Cold War planning, and modern supply chain theory. The Wehrmacht died on those ideas. The U.S. military grew stronger because of them. And in every staff college on Earth, one sentence became inevitable. The Red Ball Express won the war as surely as any armored division. We cast to the stirves of President Plain. It lasted only 82 days. But those 82 days changed the trajectory of a continent. They proved the power of a nation not in its tanks or its planes, but in its engines and its endurance in truck drivers who refused to let exhaustion or segregation define them. The Red Ball Express was never meant to be remembered as glamorous. It wasn't. It was dirty. It was chaotic. It was thankless. But it worked. And because it worked, Europe was liberated months sooner. Because it worked, the German army collapsed harder and faster. Because it worked, millions of lives were saved. A temporary army. A permanent lesson. For all its scale, all its engineering audacity, all its strategic brilliance, the Red Ball Express was ultimately carried forward by something far simpler. The quiet, invisible courage of the men who drove it. Not the generals in headquarters. Not the officers drafting flowcharts. Not the engineers drawing new bypasses at dawn. But the drivers, the ones whose stories never made it into war, briefings, or newspapers, or speeches. Men who fought the road long after the gunfire had faded. No photograph can capture what it felt like inside a Red Ball truck at 3 a.m. Exhausted lungs inhaling dust, headlights bouncing over cratered roads, a windshield smeared with mud and insects, the steering wheel vibrating against numb fingers. Many drivers fought two enemies, the Germans ahead and the darkness around them. A corporal from Georgia once said, "The hardest battles weren't on the map. They were in the cab, when your eyelids felt heavier than your cargo." With 5 signed actions as General Dow's, some kept themselves awake by singing, some by chewing coffee grounds, some by slapping their own faces raw. Some tied a canteen to the roof so that each bump would splash cold water down their neck. But every man stayed behind the wheel because he knew a single stalled truck could choke an entire convoy, and that meant lives on the front line. Heroism isn't always a charge toward the enemy. Sometimes it's refusing to close your eyes. Official reports list 300 Red Ball drivers killed, but the unofficial stories suggest more, because the dangers weren't the kind that won medals. Trucks rolled off cliffs in fog. Engines exploded from overwork. Brakes failed on steep descents. Drivers fell asleep and never woke up again. There were no infantry honors for such deaths, no battlefield citations, no parades. Just a truck flipped on its side in a ditch, a tarp torn by fire, a driver's helmet resting on the ground beside an overturned vehicle. Yet without those men, the ones who died without glory, without recognition, without even gunfire to mark their sacrifice, the Allied advance would have slowed, faltered, maybe even reversed. Victory often belongs to those whose names history never learns. 3/4 of the drivers were African American soldiers, many of whom had volunteered hoping to fight, but were told that their role was to serve, not to lead. But in the Red Ball Express, they did lead every night, every mile, every impossible demand. They led convoys, they commanded maintenance teams, they kept the entire Third Army alive. And yet, when trucks stopped rolling, the segregation walls reappeared. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate promotions. The very men who had carried the army forward were pushed back into the margins. A black driver remembered years later, they told us we weren't fit for combat. But we kept the war moving. Funny, how the country moves on our backs, but won't let us sit beside it. The saying, still they drove, because they understood something deeper than recognition. The war needed them, even if the army didn't admit it. And history cannot be honest without them. Not all the heroism was physical. Some carried letters they hadn't opened in weeks. Some carried fears they didn't speak aloud. Some carried the faces of friends who had flipped trucks days earlier. Some carried exhaustion like a second skin. But all of them carried the war. A driver once told his sergeant, "You fight your war with rifles. We fight ours with wheels." Benign. It was said as a joke. It wasn't one. Because every American shell fired, every advance made, every liberated town, all of it passed first through the hands of a driver gripping a steering wheel in the dark. There are many ways to be a hero. The Red Ball drivers chose the one history almost missed. By the time the Red Ball Express finally ground to a halt in November 1944, Europe had already shifted under its weight. The front lines were unrecognizable from the summer. German divisions that once fought with cold precision were now retreating in fractured bursts. And Patton's Third Army, the very force the Wehrmacht swore would collapse under its own appetite, was pressing on the borders of Germany itself. Yet the true legacy of the Red Ball couldn't be seen on maps. It could only be understood by looking at what didn't happen. Towns that weren't reduced to rubble because American artillery never ran out. Battalions that didn't starve in the field because convoys delivered rations faster than they could be consumed. Attacks that never stalled because fuel arrived even when weather, exhaustion, and physics said it shouldn't. And a winter that never became the catastrophe the Germans hoped it would be. Victory often reveals itself not in the battles won, but in the disasters prevented. When Germany finally collapsed, the Allies interrogated hundreds of Wehrmacht officers, asking the same question again and again. When did you know the war was lost? I hate. Some said Normandy. Some said the Falaise pocket. Some said the loss of air superiority. But among logistics officers, the answer was almost universal. When we understood the supply system that followed Patton, Einstein. One general stated it with blunt despair. You fought with trucks. We fought with hope. Your trucks lasted longer. If not, another added, we prepared to stop tanks, planes, and infantry. We never prepared to stop 6,000 trucks. Who? Even the most doctrinal German thinkers, men raised on Clausewitz and Moltke, trained in the art of maneuver, masters of the War College, admitted that they had been defeated not by tactics but by a supply line that made tactics irrelevant. It wasn't a glamorous truth, but it was the real one. Within the U.S. Army, the impact was quieter but deeper. Generals who had spent their careers studying battlefield maneuvers suddenly saw war through a new lens. Supply wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't support. It wasn't something to fix when things went wrong. Supply was the battlefield. The Red Ball had proven it. A memo circulated at Sh headquarters in late '44 captured the shift perfectly. An army that can feed itself outruns defeat. An army that cannot consumes itself. BS. This wasn't poetry. It was doctrine written in oil stains, blown tires, sleepless drivers, and engines pushed to the breaking point. But the Americans understood something else as well. The victory the Red Ball created came at a cost few would ever see. Thousands of trucks were destroyed, tens of thousands of tires shredded, engines replaced until the supply of replacements ran dry. Drivers burned out and reassigned before they collapsed for good. Lives lost to accidents never listed as combat deaths. These were not glamorous sacrifices. They didn't fit on medals. But they were sacrifices all the same. Patton's tanks did not roll on heroism alone. They rolled on gasoline delivered by hands that shook from exhaustion. Every mile the Third Army advanced was a mile paid for by drivers who no one photographed, no one celebrated, no one credited, not at the time. But history remembers more honestly than war does. When the last convoy rolled off the Red Ball route, The roads were scarred, the bridges dented, the forests shaken by months of endless trucks. But the silence that followed felt almost unnatural, as if something massive had inhaled for 82 days straight and finally exhaled. The French countryside would heal. The German army would not. And the American military would never again underestimate the power of logistics. The Red Ball Express had proven a simple truth. Armies win battles. Supply wins wars. And for 82 days, 6,000 trucks carried victory across France at 35 miles per hour. When the last truck rolled off the Red Ball corridor, no one realized they were closing the chapter on one of the most extraordinary operations in the history of war. The drivers stepped out of their cabs, stretching stiff legs, rubbing aching wrists, blinking at the sudden quiet. For the first time in nearly 3 months, the roads of France were still. The men didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. Survivors of exhaustion, of mechanical chaos, of a race against distance and time that no battlefield ever commemorated. But history would do what the battlefield didn't. Because long after generals published their memoirs, long after armored divisions earned their medals, and long after the headlines celebrated the liberation of Paris and the defeat of Hitler's armies, historians digging into the numbers began to see the truth. None of it would have happened on schedule without the Red Ball Express. It didn't fire a shot. It didn't storm a trench. It didn't weld its place into history with explosions or bayonets, but it carried the war forward, every day, every mile, every impossible demand. And perhaps that's why its story vanished for so long. It lacked the drama people think wins wars. But wars are not won by drama. Wars are won by endurance, by the unglamorous, by the overlooked, by the men who stayed awake when their bodies begged them to sleep. If you ask most people what won the war in Europe, they'll point to Normandy, the Bulge, Berlin, the battles written in bold ink. Few will mention the 23,000 drivers who carved a highway out of thin air. But German officers remembered, some too clearly. A former panzer commander wrote years later, "We prepared for your tanks, your aircraft, your infantry. We never prepared for your trucks. How do you kill a weapon that never stops moving? It." That question lingered in the ruins of the Third Reich. It still lingers now, because the Red Ball Express wasn't simply a supply line, it was a revelation. It proved that victory belongs to those who can sustain the impossible longer than the enemy can understand it. In the end, the Red Ball Express didn't just push Patton across France. It pushed military thinking into a new era. An era where logistics is no longer background, but battlefield. Where the ability to move becomes the ability to win. Where endurance becomes a form of firepower. The Red Ball drivers didn't fight for glory, but they created it for others, and they left behind a lesson sharper than any blade. Armies may carry rifles, but it is supply that carries armies. That's the truth the Germans discovered too late, and the truth we remember now. In the roar of engines that once lit the French night, in the roads still scarred by their wheels, and in the war they shortened by months simply by refusing to stop driving. If you've reached this point, then you already know the truth. Most history books skip. Wars are not won by the loudest battles, but by the quietest engines. The Red Ball Express didn't look heroic, yet it reshaped the war more than many divisions that carried rifles. And now I want to hear from you. Which moment from this story struck you the hardest? Was it the German officers realizing their calculations no longer mattered? The drivers racing exhaustion instead of enemy fire? Or the idea that 6,000 trucks could change the fate of a continent? Tell me in the comments. Your insights help me decide which forgotten stories deserve to be brought back to life next. And if you want more episodes that go deeper than textbooks and show the war the way soldiers lived it, make sure you don't miss the next one.